Good afternoon from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and welcome again to Hindsight Up Front. I'm Mark Green, President and CEO. Our first episode in this series on Ukraine took on Moscow's false assertion that NATO had somehow promised the Russians that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. Our second featured two Senate leaders who offered their impressions from a recent visit to Ukraine and why they co-authored the recent Lend-Lease legislation for military assistance to the Zelensky government. A third featured a candid interview with the Minister of State in Germany's Foreign Office, addressing both some of what had been perceived as a diplomatic gap between Washington and Berlin and the importance of NATO unity. You can access all of these episodes and a treasure trove of research and scholarship about Russia and Ukraine by going to thewilsoncenter.org/Hindsight Ukraine. As we gather today, Moscow has not yet sent in forces that it's amassed along the border. In just a few hours, President Biden will address the nation once again. And yet, in so many ways, an assault on Ukraine has been going on for some time. Cyber attacks, military exercises in Belarus and elsewhere obviously meant to intimidate, and the weaponization of information, not to mention Russian occupation of Crimea and the portions of the Donbass region. Congress and the administration are really united in their goal of deterring an incursion, but in some ways isn't something underway already? Tough questions, complicated answers. Fortunately, we have one of the sharpest thinkers on national security, defense policy, and the changing nature of our threats and our needs. Our guest today is Michèle Flournoy, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and top defense advisor in the Obama administration. She also co-founded the Center for a New American Security, where she now chairs the board, and West Exec Advisors. Michèle Flournoy, welcome to the Wilson Center. It's good to have you.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's great to be with you.
So, you heard me lay out a little bit of it. So where are we in your opinion?
So we are on the brink of a potential war in Europe. We've seen Russia amass the largest military force in Europe for potentially aggressive purposes since World War II. There's a chance that, we might still have some diplomatic breakthrough and a de-escalation of the crisis, but I think that is becoming, with every passing day, increasingly remote. You have basically Russia with forces on three fronts in Belarus conducting a so-called military exercise, but poised to come down from the north towards Kiev. You have a huge amount of Russian forces amassed on the border with eastern Ukraine, near the Donbass region. And you also have naval forces and amphibious ships with troops aboard amassed in the Black Sea, ready to come up from that direction. So huge amount of pressure, plus things we've never seen deployed in an exercise, like Iskander missiles, which are longer range missiles that can actually hold NATO capitals at risk. Lots of airborne units, special operations, field hospitals being moved forward to the front. So this is a very worrisome situation. And I hope I'm wrong, but my assessment is that Putin knows what he wants. He wants to either wring concessions from the Zelensky government to a binding promise that Ukraine will never join NATO, or he wants to put in a government that is more friendly to Russia, that will be willing to make that promise. And whether he gets it by diplomacy or through the use of force, I think he is fairly determined to do that.
We've been talking about the Biden approach to all of this has been actually quite distinctive. We've seen the quick release of information almost by the day, at least in the last couple of weeks. Every time Putin makes a move or at least sends a signal, someone from the Biden administration comes forward and lays it out for the American public. We've heard talk about, the cyber attacks, obviously, but a false flag operation, the numbers that are being amassed, the readiness of the troop posture of the Russians. Isn't that unusual? And what do you think the Biden administration's accomplishing with this?
It is unusual. As you know, Mark, sitting in the Situation Room, there's always a big debate about Do you reveal the intelligence and potentially compromise sources and methods? Do you hold it back? What can we say unclassified? All of that is a big debate. But I think they have decided to be in a proactive posture, because one thing we know about Putin, he is a master of disinformation and misinformation and creating untrue, making lies seem like new facts. And so I think they've decided as a matter of policy that every time he sort of sets the stage for some kind of manufactured provocation or misinformation, they're going to knock it down with facts and the truth and evidence as much as they can possibly share. And I think they've done a really good job of that. And you can expect to see more of that as this crisis unfolds.
So Putin may still move forward, but he won't be able to characterize it as a Ukrainian invasion or incursion on Russia.
He will certainly try, but I think far fewer people will believe him. Unfortunately, there's a real risk that his own population will believe him because he's got such tight control over the information that most Russians hear.
Do you think some of this is a reaction to what we saw with the annexation of Crimea? I mean, we obviously saw the mobilization of information by Putin and Russian irregulars moving in, and then lo and behold, one day they declared through this false, phony election that this was part of Russia. Is this a response to that?
I think it's sort of a once burned, twice shy kind of situation where we've seen this playbook before. This one's a little different, obviously, but I think the administration's very attuned to what Putin is up to, and they are reading the signs, and they are not taking any chances of being fooled or being unprepared, or what have you. I think that's likely if he does actually come into Ukraine with military forces. I think you're going to also see a different approach to sanctions. Remember, back in 2014, it was very incremental, sort of as he took more and more aggressive steps, we kind of turned up the heat gradually. I think this time they're likely to take a different approach, which is go big and then ratchet down if he pulls back or if he complies with the conditions that we set. So I think it's going to be a very different approach based on lessons learned from the last chapter of this story.
And do you think it's in part a reaction to the experience of Afghanistan?
Well, I think the experience of Afghanistan, I'm sure, many of the same people are involved, certainly on the White House and at the senior levels in the National Security Council, and so forth. And I think, they are staying on top of this. They are looking at every detail. They've pulled together a very extensive interagency planning, and we've just read recently in the press some wargaming and scenario tabletop work so that they really think through the different contingencies and what they need to be prepared for, because there's all kinds of challenges here. I mean, if Putin goes in, you're going to see massive refugee flows. We have to be prepared for that. You're going to have probably a massive cyber element of the attack that tries to take down the communications system in Ukraine, and possibly even cyber attacks on NATO allies and even the US. You're going to, maybe the Russians may have their own economic playbook, trying to deny critical exports of rare earths or things that we depend on them for. They'll certainly play the energy card with Europe. So there's a lot of work to be done to think through how this is going to go, and also how to mitigate risks and most importantly, keep NATO and the transatlantic alliance unified in how we're responding to all of this.
Yeah, I had mentioned the information releases by Biden as being a distinctive feature of the Biden response, but just as distinctive is the amount of time that the administration has spent in tending to allies and reinforcing as much as possible that projected unity. I mean, there clearly are a few differences along the way, but nonetheless, the president spent a great deal of time in trying to reinforce that sense of unity in the face of Putin's aggression.
And the president and his whole team, I mean, they have been working the phones, they've been on airplanes, they have no, no European ally can complain that they weren't, deeply consulted and kept in the know. I mean, they've really worked on this hard. And I think, at best, it's going to pay off to, you know, a shared approach, a unified approach to things like sanctions that will cause some pain in Europe, will cause some pain here. And to the extent we have some differences, I think those are going to be managed in a way that those differences don't undercut, the very forceful approach that the United States is going to take to on the non-military side.
And maybe that's a reaction to Afghanistan as well. I think one of the criticisms we heard from some of our allies in Afghanistan is at least parts of it were a surprise to them, or perhaps they weren't kept in touch as much as possible. Clearly here, again, it's maybe, as you said, some of the same people. We all learn as we go, spending a lot of time making sure that the information flow is steady.
I think that's right. The other thing that's ironic about this is, one of Putin's greatest fears is a strong NATO with a strong military posture in the frontline states of the Baltics and Poland and Romania and so forth. And the irony is that this crisis that he's manufactured has actually pulled NATO together, reinvigorated its sense of purpose and importance and buy-in across the board, and will create a more robust NATO posture facing Russia. So, I mean, he's managed to create his own worst nightmare in pursuing this course of action.
Well, let's all hope it works, right? Let me something I read earlier today as I was getting ready for this. There was a piece on Axios in which an author referred to this as the first TikTok war. In other words, you're seeing both from perhaps Putin's direct forces a sharing of videos, but also from citizens, both ways, both Russians and Ukrainians sharing video clips of troop buildup and vulnerabilities. Is this what we're going to see going forward, not just here, but perhaps in all forms of conflict and defense mobilization?
I think that is a change. Even back in 2014, we saw a lot of people posting pictures on Facebook. Now we're getting, the more advanced version of videos on TikTok. And it speaks to the fact that we live in this information saturated world where it's very difficult for a government or a military to move in a stealthy way because there's so many sources of capturing that and sharing it publicly in a completely unclassified way. And I think that is bolstering the administration's ability to be more transparent, share more information about what is happening, because they probably have a number of unclassified sources that have been validated and verified that they can put out with no trouble at all. But I think this is an enduring feature of the future environment for sure.
Well, it certainly has its advantages in terms of from the administration perspective, perhaps being able to pierce through some fog. On the other hand, you have no control over it either. So it goes both ways, and perhaps it hastens the sense of concern and menace as 130,000 Russians do move to the border.
There's also a huge risk of disinformation. So filtered into those YouTubes, that are available, Russian disinformation, Russian misinformation, doctored videos, which is now quite, emerging as quite possible. So literally manufacturing videos that misrepresent the facts. Like, here's a video of some, claimed provocation by Ukrainians that didn't actually happen. So I think we have to be mindful of that as well.
Another piece I saw from David Ignatius, again, we're trying to look at how this all works out. What are the U.S. goals? What are the things that they can point to as reasonably achievable? And one thing he said that I thought was interesting is that he said, first off, if Russia goes in, Ukraine will largely fight alone. On the other hand, Russia's problems won't be just Russia's. it won't be just Ukraine's. He said there's the sense that U.S. officials hope that there will be a Ukrainian porcupine too difficult for the Russian economy and government to swallow. Is that what the objective is in many ways, is to, if Russians do move in with tanks and troops, to make it as painful and as difficult as possible for Moscow to try to maintain any kind of a grip on those parts of Ukraine they roll into?
Absolutely. I think it's really important for us to think of this in sort of different time frames. I mean, in the short term, if Russia comes in with its full military might, Ukraine will not be able to stop them, right? So they will have some tactical victories and be able to potentially put Kiev under siege and put huge pressure on the government, maybe even topple the government. But that's not the end of it, right? That's the beginning. Now they're in there, and you have to think about the longer game. First of all, even if just 10% of the Ukrainian population decides to fight this, that will be a heck of an insurgency. And you can be sure that Western powers, at least some number of them, will be supporting that insurgency as much as possible. You will have massive sanctions put in place: energy, financial, travel, export controls, maybe even things like sanctioning the insurance industry. So Russian ships, Russian transport, they're hampering their trade, that would not be able to proceed as normal. So there'll be a very heavy economic burden. There'll be complete diplomatic isolation. You can expect NATO to meet, EU to meet, Putin to be unwelcome anywhere in the world except maybe, meeting with Xi in Beijing, right? So this is the longer game. If you end up with Putin versus the West, it's not going to be a pretty picture, and it's not a winning game for him. So, I hope that we don't have to go through those early days and see this invasion play out in Ukraine. But I don't think Putin's going to ultimately achieve his objectives, because I think we will stand as a transatlantic community, and more broadly, our allies around the world don't want to see Putin succeed. No one wants to see in the 21st century an authoritarian government be able to overthrow a sovereign, however imperfect democracy, but a democracy, and succeed. I mean, that's a terrible threat to the rules-based order that we have worked so hard for decades to put in place.
And those of us who have been to Ukraine and been to Kyiv and seen the monuments to the so-called, or they call themselves, the Heavenly 100, those who sacrificed themselves to bring about democracy in the face of Yanukovych, there's simply no doubting the character of the Ukrainian people or their courage. And should Putin decide to invade, we can expect Ukrainians to fight hard, fight courageously, and keep doing so.
And I would hope that Putin, before he pulls the trigger, would take a lesson from history. I mean, the Soviets dealt with this in Afghanistan. We dealt with it in Afghanistan. When you have an insurgency that is committed and has external support, and in some cases sanctuary, it's very, very hard to defeat. So, I mean, he shouldn't make the mistake that I would argue that people like Secretary Rumsfeld and others made going into Iraq, thinking you can waltz in, topple a government, put somebody you like in place, and waltz out, and it will all be fine. Didn't go that way. And that's not how Ukraine will go. Putin will pay a very heavy price, and he needs to think about that before he makes the decision.
What more should the administration be doing right now?
I think they're, leaning forward hard. I'm really glad to hear the president is about to speak. I think continuing to stay arm in arm with our allies. I would hope that we're thinking about not only the large sanctions package, but how on the cyber front, almost certainly cyber will become a dimension of this. How can we back up Ukraine and help restore, give them some resilience under attack? What can we do to make sure that our systems are as resilient as possible if there's some kind of retaliation? Are there things that we can do with deniability that would make it really complicate the Russians' ability to sustain their forces forward. Remember, they're going to be away from home. They need to have logistics and supplies and all of that. How can we use non-kinetic means to try to ensure that those systems don't work very well? So these are the kinds of policy questions that the team's going to have to grapple with. I'm sure they're working through all of this in detail.
So what you've just laid out is making the best of a bad situation.
Yes.
So I guess the question is, as we sit here, in your mind, what does success look like? And maybe more fairly, give me the range of success, because there's so many variables and unknowns as we gather right now.
Yeah. I mean, real success would be convincing Putin up front that he can't succeed or the cost is too high. And so that we find a way to de-escalate this situation and negotiate, something with him. But I think that's, again, I think increasingly unlikely. I think success, if he goes in, is to prevent him from bringing Ukraine permanently into the Russian orbit, and to ultimately forcing the withdrawal of his troops, as as the scenario plays out, and the restoration of a Ukrainian government that's chosen by the Ukrainian people, and so forth. I do think there's lots of lessons we can learn even now from the crisis as it's unfolded. We need to work harder on reducing Europe's energy dependence on Russia. We need to work harder on cyber resilience, ours and those of other countries that we're partnered with. We need to think about other means of deterrence beyond simply sending in our own conventional military forces, which President Biden has taken off the table. And we need to be thinking hard about how do we avoid miscalculation, something we haven't talked about. If this goes forward, you're gonna have Russian forces and NATO forces right up against each other. I don't think NATO forces are planning to go in, but imagine a Russian incursion into the Baltic airspace, or something that happens in the Black Sea, or what have you. There are all kinds of, there's room for accident, room for miscalculation. We have to be very, very careful that anything like that leads to escalation.
I was struck in my conversation with the Minister of State from Germany. He cast all of this as a test of the strength of economic sanctions as a deterrence force. The Germans obviously believe that is, at the end of the day, the best chance for success. But isn't this really a true test of that model? If it doesn't work, if Putin decides to go in anyway, can we say that as a deterrent force, economic sanctions have failed, or they're insufficient by themselves?
Yeah, the problem is, I think because in 2014 he weathered the sanctions pretty well, he probably overestimates of his ability to weather these. I think this will be very different. I think this package will be much more robust. But the problem is it's going to take time for them to bite and for him to really feel the pain. So, there's two types of deterrence. There's deterrence that convinces your adversary that he can't possibly succeed. That's by denial. And then there's deterrence by cost imposition. And sometimes that cost imposition has to be experienced to work. And so I think that's the situation we're in. We may not be able to deter the invasion, but perhaps we can convince him to reverse it.
Do you think that perhaps Putin is calculating that, just what you've said, that the sanctions, the cumulative effect of the sanctions, because it takes time, the West, obviously led by the U.S., but the West will lose its resolve, and at some point the pain of those sanctions, where clearly there'll be pain in Europe, and yes, we'll feel pain, at some point citizens will cause us to walk away or back down?
Yeah, I think he's miscalculating that he can divide Europe within Europe and divide us, the United States, from Europe. I think he's underestimating the solidarity in this situation, and he's miscalculating. But I do think that's his assumption.
And that, in many ways, will be, if he does move in, maybe that'll be the determinative factor in this. Whether or not we're able to, and it will take work, we're able to maintain that unity and that consensus and that resolve. So we're at an interesting moment. We've got information wars, we've got cyber attacks, figuring out how you respond to cyber attacks, figuring out how you get one step in front of information wars, rapidly changing, but obviously we're all learning a lot. And as we've discussed at the Wilson Center, hindsight up front, we try to learn those lessons as close to real time as we can. Michèle, I'm very grateful for the time that you've spent with us. I've learned a lot. And let's hope that we'll be able to celebrate Mr. Putin coming to his senses and realizing that this is not a porcupine that he should want to swallow.
I certainly hope so.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And again, to our viewers, if you'd like to learn more about Hindsight Up Front, Ukraine, please go to our website. You'll find a whole treasure trove of materials. And our guest today has been former Undersecretary and Defense Policy Advisor Michèle Flournoy. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.